So welcome back. In terms of social class, we found like 4 social classes in Germany, and we can see like the clusters in the multiple correspondence analysis, even though we don't see the dividing lines between them. I will say something about the dividing lines on the next slide, or with regard to the next slide. Now I will just explain these 4 classes. We find a lower class in Germany, which we call marginalized, because it's actively excluded. So in Norbert Elias's way, we could say it's being excluded from decent work, from education, from participation in most aspects of society, and so on. And we estimate that this class comprises up to 20% of the population. You would not think this. You would think in Germany this class would be much smaller, or it doesn't exist at all. But you're wrong about this. This year we just reached the amount of 1 million homeless people in Germany. So even the homeless are a significant percentage of the population, and of course there are many marginalized who are not homeless. They live in shelters, or they live with family, or they have a small apartment or something like that. Of course, we have a large number of unemployed, say 6% of the active population, which would translate into probably something like 12% in real terms, and so on and so on. So this is a large group, but of course their living conditions are on average much better than in a country like Brazil or so. First, because of the social system, and then secondly, of the position of Germany in the hierarchy of states, which means the general living standard is higher. Then we have a large middle class, and this middle class is much larger than in most countries, except maybe US or so. And this is very interesting, this class, because it consists of 2 tradition lines. This is something we have not really found so much in other countries. I said a class is a tradition line. Now I contradict myself, because in the case of Germany we have 2 tradition lines in one class. How is that possible? Because there's mobility, social mobility between the 2 classes. So our definition of social class cannot apply to these 2 tradition lines. And what are these? One of these groups is, to make it easy, is the proletariat, or the laborers, and the others are the employees, to make it easy. And the interesting thing is, in the 1920s, 30s, these 2 groups switched position. So before 1920, the laborers were below the employees, and ever since it's the other way around, because the children of the laborers today are skilled laborers, or today as we speak, they're even IT professionals and so on, so people who make a lot of money, they have a high level of education. The employees in Germany in the 1910s, 20s, 30s did not invest in education. So they had basic education, but they did not develop into a skilled laboring class. Thank you so much. And in the 1920s, we had a study in Germany by Theodor Geiger, who used the concept of mentality instead of habitus, but the study was quite similar to ours. And he distinguished 5 classes. You can see here it's 5 tradition lines. And if you go back to Marx in the Communist Manifesto, he distinguishes 4 classes. The marginalized, he sort of incorporates the racist, classist attitude towards them. He calls them Lumpenproletariat, as you may know, which means like the proletariat in rags, or this would translate into something like the dirty or so people. So this is for him the lowest class, and then of course the proletariat, and then he speaks about the old middle class, the shopkeepers and petty traders, and the upper class. The shopkeepers and old middle class, he already predicted, will lose its relevance, and actually by the time Geiger wrote his book in the 1920s, they had disappeared. So this class has disappeared, but the proletariat was differentiated increasingly into employees and proletariat, and mostly the employees were former peasants and people from the countryside, and they never invested into education, and that's why they were sort of on a downhill track while the proletariat was an uphill movement. But this is rather particular to Germany. You don't really have the same movement in other countries. Similar movements in some countries, but not exactly the same. Why? Because the German working class around 1900 was already a rather organized group, and they had pride, and they had a culture, and they had education, and they had even educational programs. And one of Max Weber's best books is on the stock exchange, and this is something he wrote for the working class association in Germany in order for them to understand how the stock exchange works. So this is, you don't have this in Brazil, I'm sure, but you had Max Weber writing a book for the German working class in Germany. So it's a particular configuration, and the descendants of this class profit from this position up to this day, because now they make as much money as a university professor, they are highly skilled, they have pride, and they are on the verge, almost on the verge of becoming upper middle class. Not really yet, there's a strong dividing line between upper middle class and middle class, but still they're moving, and those people without education, they're moving downwards. And this is what we see in this class. Two tradition lines that cannot communicate because they have completely different cultures, but there's still intermixture and, contact and so on. And even politically, I'm not 100% sure, but I would suppose that the working class people are more liberal, leftist, and the employees are more rightist, because this is already what happened during fascism. The employees were the group who voted for fascism, and not the lowest class and not the proletariat. Above this, we have the upper middle class, which we call established class. And these terms refer to a class culture and also to the symbolic dividing lines between the classes. Of course, this is rather clear, upper middle class, and the dominant class is maximum 0.1%. It could be even smaller, but it's comparatively large in Germany. It's even larger in the US because of the position of the country in the global power structure. So much money has been flooded into Germany, and so much exploitation has taken place that it's enough to feed a large dominant class. And the history of this class is also quite easy to explain. According to sociologists, including Bourdieu, this class doesn't exist, because they don't have access. So in Bourdieu's distinction, there is no upper class, really. And most other sociologists, same. I have two former students who work for the #1 German Marketing Research Institute, and I talked to them about it, and both of them said, without even thinking, of course there's an upper class. And of course it's completely different from the rest of society. Why? Because it's their job. So they have to cater with their marketing research and so on for social groups, and if they make mistakes, they don't get a job anymore. So they have to be correct. And of course, this group spends about half of the consumption GDP in Germany, even though it's so small. And of course, these people don't go into a shop and buy a coffee or their clothes. They don't go into a shopping center, or they don't fly in a regular airplane and so on. So you don't see them, and they have completely different patterns of behavior. And in Germany, you can trace their origins back to the 30 Years' War, and in the case of many families, even 1,000 years. Many of these old families, in fact, are Italian-German, because it used to be one country or one empire in the Middle Ages, the German Roman Empire. So many of the families are present in both countries, or they've migrated from one to the other, but their connections, often in family names, it's difficult to discern because they're Germanized or Italicized, but still, these are the origins. Supposedly, aristocracy doesn't exist in Germany anymore and doesn't play a role, but you're wrong about this, because many of the most influential families are aristocratic. The largest owners of forests are the aristocratic families in Germany and Austria. Some of the richest families are aristocratic, and many of the inner city crown jewels, like the castles and so on, are owned by these families. And what happened is, and now we come back to social mobility, in the 19th century with industrialization in Germany, which was a bit later than in most of the neighboring countries, some families got really rich. And it's a pattern, I studied this a bit, it's a pattern. Almost all, or actually all the families I studied have their origins in colonial trade. Colonial trade in Germany would mean at the time to sell stuff that the Dutch brought in via the Rhine Valley into Germany, because Germany didn't have colonies at that time. But the colonial traders, they then used the money to invest in production. They produced these colonial goods themselves or associated stuff, and then steel and so on. And all of this happened especially along the Rhine Valley. And these people who became rich, of course, they did not come from the lowest groups of society, but they didn't come from anything like an upper class or group either. They married into the aristocracy. And this is the German upper class, if you like. And it's a small group, and it's closed. You don't get access to it. I wrote to 50 families, and all of them replied on nice paper and so on, due to our wish protecting our privacy and saving our family secrets. We don't give interviews. It was very difficult to access them, and only through contacts and loops and so on was I able to get interviews with these people. So what are the dividing lines between these classes, and how are they reinforced? As I said, it's very similar to something like racism or so. People assess each other also on the basis of social class, and you immediately sense if this person is somehow, say, socially near you or not. And if you don't sense it, the other person certainly will. It's unlikely that neither of you senses if you have something in common or you don't. And this is symbolically reinforced. So there's something like classism, like Marx's statement about the lowest class I just referred to, the class in rags or the dirty. This is exactly what I mean. An entire group of people is devalued and assessed as valueless or worthless in this case. This is what we sort of do in everyday life, but the other classes have similar distinctions between them. And in Germany, what is very interesting is, and there is some truth in Marxism with regard to this, the distinctions are very closely associated to labor, or capital and labor. The lowest class is the class that doesn't work. The middle class is the class who works, that does all the work. And the upper middle class, or established class, is the class that leads the work, or sort of, is the functional elite in sociological terms. And the upper class doesn't work either because it has capital. It lives off capital and it doesn't have to work. So these people are the only ones where I conducted interviews and people answered, job? I've never worked. I've been lazy all my life. As far as the cliché goes in German society, this would be a characteristic of the lowest class, but nobody in the lowest class has said anything like this. Not even near this. They all do things and they all want to do things, and if they don't have a job, they do want a job, and they aspire to have the lowest paying, most terrible job just to have anything whatsoever, but they don't. So this sort of stratification was rather clear to us. We didn't suspect this, but it sort of jumped at us, and it's rather clear. And it's also very clear that the upper middle class, so people like most of us in the audience, have a very different relation to work than the lower middle class, or what we call fighters. If you give these people a win in the lottery, they will not appear at their job tomorrow. It's very clear. So they have a very functional and detached attitude towards work. This is different for us. Maybe we would leave our job, but maybe we would still continue, at least on some level or another. And most of us would consider our job part of a life project. So the job is only one aspect of life, and the job has to be meaningful. It has to fulfill us. We have to do something that has some social significance and so on. And that's why we might still continue even if we don't get paid or if we don't need the money. Completely different in the class below. So how does this now work in Brazil? Now we come back to the question I didn't answer. In Brazil we distinguish 5 classes. Yeah, and of course you recognize Jesse's terms here. The estimates of the numbers are really rough, and they're probably wrong. At least they're not correct. This is just a hypothesis, and it's only there to give you an indication that it differs from the German case. So the lowest class is much larger than in Germany, and as I'll explain in the very end, this is due to the position of the nation state in the global hierarchy, and of course also due to colonialism and so on. It's quite clear. We looked at the data again, and the postdocs among you who will be there on Thursday, you'll be able to look at the data as well, because Emerson, who kept working with the data, he brings his computer and then you can look at them. We conducted 650 interviews in Brazil, and many of them are really long. I read about 50 of those, and it took me 1 month. It's 30,000 pages or so. So it took a long time. We did these interviews in 2014 or something like this, and they have just completed the interpretation of these interviews. So now Emerson has the full data set, and this hypothesis seems to be confirmed with the 5 classes. But these 5 classes obviously do not function the same way as in Germany, and the relation to labor is not exactly the same, and we have 5 instead of 4. So there must be some kind of a difference, and what is the reason for the difference? If we use Gessé's theory, we can see that it's not applicable to Gessé's own case, because he makes these 2 dividing lines, and these 2 dividing lines apply to Germany. So dignity is what distinguishes the bulk of the population from the lowest class, very much in Marx's sense. So the lowest class is worthless. They have no dignity. This is true for the German case. And the upper middle class is the expressive class, or the sensitive class, and I just explained this. These are people who have also an aesthetic relation to their life, and it's a work of art and it's meaningful and so on, which is not true for the middle class, or say the bulk of the population. Upper class, Gessé never really sort of studied, same as Bourdieu and all the other sociologists, because they don't have access. But we did have access in Germany, so what we found particular is that they live on a different planet. They don't deal with our problems, and they have no idea what we deal with and who we are, and so on. And also, the main reason why we call them aloof is because they don't have to legitimize anything. We still have to legitimize our existence, and we want to do something meaningful, and the others, they have to work and thereby legitimize their existence. They don't. The upper class doesn't have to legitimize its existence, and they feel they're entitled to everything anyway because they're better and they're a separate species, so they're aloof. But precisely because they are aloof, we don't get access, and we have no idea about them. So this class also exists in Brazil, of course, and it's quite evident and interesting and worth studying, but we don't really need to talk about this class anymore now. The question is, where is the other dividing line, and what is it defined by? And now we move towards the answer to the question about race and so on. Now we have to include the dimension of social cultures into the study. This is what Brazil looks like today, but we do not understand this structure at all. Because we get questions like this: what about race? And then we look at our data and we see 90% in the 2 lowest classes are black, and 10% in the 3 upper classes are not white. So why is that? And there must be some significance to this, because it's evident from the data. And it's evident because of the social cultures. And we distinguish the social cultures like that. Also, this is still a hypothesis, but I think it's not so far from the truth, if we can speak of a truth. So of course in Brazil, Brazil being a colonial society, colonialism is important for the history and for the subsequent social cultures. But only if you link it to the contemporary society do you realize how significant it is even for the contemporary world. And basically, of course, colonial society consisted of the masters and the slaves, basically. And this didn't change very much after independence. Of course, you still had slavery after independence, but nevertheless, the social structure didn't change all that much. Basically, the structure of post-colonial society looked somewhat like this. The large landowners and provincial governors and these people were a very tiny dominant group. Let's not speak of class yet, dominant group. Then you had the administration, the educated urban population, you could say, and these two were basically all white. And then you had the rural population, which consisted, of course, of small-scale farmers, independent farmers, and the landless laborers, basically. And the landless laborers at first were still slaves, of course, until 1888 or so. And then came industrialization, and this is a particular social culture for Brazil, possibly also for the United States, but not for most other countries because it's associated with capitalism, and we speak about capitalism, not about industrialization. But in the US and Brazil, even Argentina to a certain degree, what you have in this period, so after 1900 especially, is a huge influx of immigrants, and especially immigrants from Europe. And they ended up mostly, as you know, I'm saying things that you know much better than me, but only to explain this. They ended up, many of them, as skilled laborers in the factories. Some of them, of course, also were educated before, and they entered the upper middle class or group, the administration or elites, if you like. But the bulk of these migrants ended up in what was to become the middle class or the middle. And the rest sort of remained to a certain degree, but as you know, many of the landowners converted from agriculture to industry, or they invested their money in industry. And this, in a way, is the origin of the contemporary social structure in Brazil, more or less. So people remain on the same level, and that also explains why most everybody in the lower two classes is dark or even black in terms of skin color, and why this is not the case for the three upper classes. And there seems to be a clear dividing line also between what Jesse calls batalhadores and ralé, even if these batalhadores, according to Jesse's study, emerged out of the lowest class, the marginalized class. I would suppose that the dividing lines were there even before, and that they are rather pronounced, and it's rather clear what this dividing line consists in. It has to do with dignity, but it's more like the honest poor and the dishonest poor. So those people who work, actually, and those people who don't work. So there we have something emerging which reminds of the German situation. And it's possible that in some time in the future the batalhadores and the middle class will merge, and then you have a colorful class, a multicolored class. It's possible, but it's also possible that it doesn't happen. We'll see. But anyway, there's some dynamic going on here, and this dynamic, of course, is partly due to political intervention, and it's also due to massive change, and in the case of the industrial socioculture, it's also has to do with technological change. But technological change itself doesn't do anything about the social structure. In this case, it's only because foreigners came in and a new class was created, just like in recent times. We can talk more about Brazil, those of you who come on Thursday, with regard to the data, because we also have new insights and we have a more precise picture, and now we have also more convincing multiple correspondence analysis. When I did this at IPEA 4 years ago or so, we only had 100 interviews interpreted, and now it's 630, so the basis is better. But upper class is still missing, so maybe you can do this also. So if we move to South Africa, some of you have read the paper on South Africa, so you recognize the multiple correspondence analysis, and it doesn't matter that you cannot read this, because you already know. But the principle is the same as with the German multiple correspondence analysis, but the particularities and differences also emerge quite clearly from this. So in this case, the diagonal is from lower right hand to upper left hand. Lower right, you have the lower classes. Upper left, you have the upper classes. And also the parameters in many regards are similar. So here you have low income, you have unemployed people, little wealth, education weak, and so on. And the opposite would be true in the upper left-hand corner. But now we come to the differences. First of all, what is very striking is the entire right-hand side is basically black in terms of skin color. And the left-hand side is non-black. And it's divided rather clearly along the y-axis. In terms of skin color, the lower left-hand quadrant is colored, mestizo, if you like, and the upper left-hand quadrant is white. And the coloreds, they associate themselves with the whites. So they interpret themselves as white, and they function very much in the white society, but by the whites they are regarded as black, or they are discriminated against. And so they are in a very unfortunate situation, and this is also evident from the interviews. It's like the black swan, also somebody who has nowhere to go, no place in society, even though their situation is better than that of the black population. They don't have a community to lean on, and often this is also associated with personal history that is the same, because often they would be the illegitimate children of the white master and the black slave. This is how they came into being, because, as you know, no mixture was allowed between 1948 and 1994. So everything had to be invisibilized, which, with regard to contacts between races, but even before, the society was at least just as racist as a British colony, just like US or so. It was deeply ingrained. And somebody asked this, how do we apply the European concepts to South Africa? With regard to South Africa, it's a bit easier because, like Brazil, it's so dominated by the European, say, baggage that was brought along, that most of the indigenous culture was erased. Not in South Africa, not to the same degree as Brazil, but to a large degree as well. And the society was basically formed by the colonizers. But this division is quite particular. Black-white, yes, you have in other slave-holding societies, but black, white, and colored, this is South Africa, and only South Africa. And in principle, what you could say is the upper right-hand corner is those people who have their roots in the rural society and the townships, and here on the left would be those people who grew up in the urban setting. And the township, rural background is very interesting in South Africa in itself, but it would lead too far for me to explain this here. The percentages are similar to Brazil in terms of class and race. So the lowest class is also as large as in Brazil, and it's also almost exclusively black, maybe even blacker than in Brazil. But in the upper classes, you have more blacks in South Africa than in Brazil. Of course, one reason being 1994, democracy, real independence, so to speak, and abolition of apartheid and so on. But another reason is the social cultures. Yeah, you can read this, right? Yes? So you have a very particular structure emerging under apartheid in South Africa. Otherwise, you would suspect South Africa and Brazil would be rather similar in many regards. And if you go there, anybody been to South Africa? Maybe some point you go, you will find it very similar to Brazil. You also have to lock your car from the inside, and when you see a black person, you have to be afraid, and so on. It's like the same type of society. But in reality, it's different, not only because of the colors, but also because of apartheid. So after 1948, when apartheid was established, apartheid means the strict separation between races, a black upper class emerged. Because in a society you don't only need workers and farmers, you also need an administration, and you need business people, so to speak, at least traders and so on. And they did emerge in the townships and in those areas where the blacks were allowed to settle. So you had an upper class within the black society. And of course, no capitalists. Of course, nobody dominating politics. Of course, no university professors and so on, but an upper class. And when now apartheid was abolished, these people remained on the same level. They did have decent amount of economic capital. They had an above average amount of economic capital, they had social capital, and they were used to being in a dominant position. So these people entered the middle class and even upper middle class. And through the ANC, this is the blue arrow here, the ANC, the dominant political party, some blacks had the possibility to rise to the very top, to become members of the upper class, like Mandela himself. This is not known really, but Mandela and Zuma and now Ramaphosa, they're all billionaires. They're not only powerful political people, but they were basically bribed by the white establishment to grant them the privileges that they still enjoy. And Mandela was particularly bribed not to undertake any socialist experiments after 1994. And of course, this showed up in his bank account. And Ramaphosa is a businessman, so he made his money himself, but of course the ANC background is what made it possible. So the elite, or let's not say elites, but the real upper class of South Africa today is 90% white, like Brazil, but you have 10% real black, which is different from Brazil, and this is due to these two factors, A and C on the one hand, and apartheid on the other hand. And this means your question is really relevant. We could say South Africa, US, Brazil, same thing. Not really, or not quite. There are significant differences, and they do not only concern such things as skin color, but they touch the entire fabric of the society, including skin color. And I had to use an indigenous term, apartheid, in order to make this understood. And this is due to the prehistory, to the social cultures. So if we look only at the right-hand column, we would say, okay, Brazil, South Africa, more or less the same thing. But then we don't understand the dynamics, and we don't understand how inequality is reproduced, because here the racism itself plays less of a role than, say, the apartheid structure itself. Whereas in Brazil, there was no apartheid, it's more the racism itself and the colonial past. And this matters also if you want to do something about inequality. You have to understand which problems to address. And the conventional analyses of inequality, they completely ignore this and do not talk about it, if they talk about class at all. But usually they talk only about profession or wealth or income. So if we move to the next society, next MCA, which country is this? I give you 100 reais. This should be motivation, no? Yeah, you're upper middle class, so you don't need my money. Fine. This is Thailand. Anybody here in the room who has any knowledge of Thai language would have recognized right away, because there are indigenous terms in here. And this is important, and that's why I asked you to wait in order to see how the indigenous terms figure into our analysis. Once again, we have a very unique picture, in a way even more unique than South Africa, because basically here we have two societies. South Africa, we used to have two societies, but here we still have two. And they are separated by the y-axis. Why this is the case, I don't really understand. Why the software is so intelligent to make these distinctions, but it works. Even our colleagues, the statisticians, they cannot explain why it works so well, even though the instrument is not made for this purpose, but it works. So basically, below the y-axis you have the capitalist structure, and above you have the pre-capitalist structure. But in contrast to basically all other societies, the pre-capitalist structure is still in charge. So it's the dominant structure. Why? Because Thailand is a monarchy which struggles to become a democracy. The first democratic revolution, which in fact was a fascist coup, from my perspective, took place in 1932, and it was inspired also by the Italian fascists. Anyway, ever since, the country has moved back and forth from democracy to military dictatorship. But the military dictatorship is not, like in Brazil, something that's carried out by the military and possibly the dominant class behind it, but it's carried out by the king. So the king says, now you move in and clean up the mess here. Otherwise, it's similar to the Brazilian situation. So the students usually start movements for democracy, then 1,000 are shot or so, and then either the movement becomes stronger or it recedes. And last time was now already like 10 years ago, the military coup, and they just had another election again. So formally now it's democracy again, so we've moved back to the lower half in a way. But the king is still the main power, and everybody knows if things go wrong, we'll have another military dictatorship. Like in Brazil right now, people have not believed what can happen in their country. Same thing in Thailand, people did not believe that they would have another military dictatorship. In 2000, if you had asked people, probably 0.5% would have said, okay, we can have another military dictatorship, but it happened. And the democracy was very much pushed by the capitalists, and also the prime ministers of the democratic governments were mainly capitalists. So there is an opposition between capitalists, new money, if you like, and the aristocracy plus monarchy in Thailand. And always when the capitalists assume too much power, the king steps and says, enough, you go where you belong. And associated with this are two middle classes, the capitalist middle class, so same middle class as we have here, or in Germany, same type, and the values are similar. And if you go to Thailand, to Bangkok, work in a university or so, you find it very similar to here, and the problems would be very similar, but you would still feel that you don't really fit in. Why? Because the administration, and now this includes also much of the university, is associated with the king. And they have clear ranks and so on, they have allegiance to the king, and they function accordingly, and the habitus is created accordingly. And at the lower end, you basically have a very large variation because you have the rural population, and they basically have one habitus only. We call it subsistential because they're not interested in accumulating wealth or anything of that sort. They're interested in survival or in having enough until the next harvest, and apart from this, they just want to have fun. This is their life. And then you have like marginalized class in the city, which is very rural in origin because most of them would be migrants from the urban areas into the cities. So the habitus is very rural, but the context is urban. And these would be like informal laborers and prostitutes. Thailand has a huge number of prostitutes, and they are usually migrants from the urban, the rural areas as well. And taxi drivers and so on. And then you have real proletarian class, which we didn't expect, but it's almost as class conscious as the German proletariat. It's skilled labor, but it's placed much lower because they make little money, they have little recognition, they have little influence, and so on. And these are two different social cultures. And why does this still persist to this degree? Any idea? Because it was never abolished. So Thailand never became a colony, so it modernized itself. It introduced capitalism by itself. But this means the older structure never disappeared. It's still there. It slowly sort of recedes, and sometime in the future I would suppose that the capitalist structure takes over. But this has been already 200 years, the process of internal modernization, a bit like in Japan. So we have two structures existing next to each other, and that's why we could even say we have 7 classes. But this is wrong, because the old structure doesn't have classes, it has ranks. And this is quite interesting. Now we come back to the indigenous, because these ranks are historically documented from about 1300 to about 1800. The society was structured in ranks, and everybody had a number according to rank. And what is quite interesting from a Western perspective, also slaves and women had rank, and women had the same rank as the men. In all other parts of the world, it's clear patriarchy, but in parts of Asia, you have gender equality or even matriarchal tendencies. So if a woman had this position or this job, she had the same number as the man accordingly. And same, slaves also had numbers, the lowest number, but they had a number. They were not excluded or non-humans or subhumans or so. But everybody had a rank, and this is reflected in linguistics, and even up to this day, you only speak Thai properly if you know how to address each other, because each rank has to call each other rank in sort of in the correct relation. So there's not one term for the king, but say a university professor has to address the king differently than a laborer or so. And this is quite, say, intricate, and you really have to know the society well in order to see the differences. And it's quite hierarchical. So for a professor it's very nice, because in Brazil or Germany, the relationship between professor and students not all that hierarchical anymore. So I cannot just tell you, go get me a coffee. You say, go get it yourself. But in Thailand, I could even tell you, okay, take back my bag to the hotel, and then get me the dinner, and then get me a taxi, and maybe even pay for my taxi. And you'd have to do it, yeah. So it's the old structure, and it's called Sakdina. And we have to use the indigenous term because this is how it works. We have no Western term for this structure. And these work together, so we have a Western concept and an indigenous concept working together. And finally, to make matters much more complicated, we turn to India. India is the most complex and therefore most interesting society. Anybody been to India before? Ah, good. Yeah. You'll not be the same after being to India. So all other places are kind of similar, but India will do something to you. And of course, if you go to India, you look at the very right-hand column. If you go to India, just like if you go to South Africa, you will feel, okay, this is Brazil. You know, it's very similar. You have a huge group of people who live in non-human conditions and who are really, living in just a terrible life. And it's the majority, or at least half of the population. And they're not so much, visible in terms of skin color, but in terms of caste, and you can recognize them after a certain period of time in India. And also the structure is very similar, and the way it works, and the way the classes live on different planets. Gonzalo Zaravi's term with regard to Mexico, the classes live on different planets. Yeah, in India, this is also very much the case, and just the distance between the class is incredible, and it's even much larger than in Brazil. So for example, you have this billionaire in Mumbai. He built himself a house, a villa, with 27 floors. 27 floors, right next to a slum. So you exit your slum house and you make, say, not even £1 a day. You walk out and you see this, this is India. It's much more extreme than Brazil, but the structure is very similar. But you will feel like in Thailand, you feel at home, but then at the same time you don't, because things work differently and you don't know why, and you don't understand. And this is due to the complexity of pre-capitalist structures. With Thailand, we had 2 effective structures existing at the same time, but with regard to India, we have at least 5 coexisting at the same time. And this is how we make sense of the complexity of India. The social cultures from the past, they still exist today and are relevant. So if we start from the local level, and this is something that I mentioned earlier, that we also look at the local level, and I also referred to India, to the large variation of villages, that you have matriarchal and patriarchal and caste and non-caste villages and so on. You have villages where everybody belongs to the same caste, and therefore there are no social differences, really. They all have the same profession because they belong to the same caste, and that means they have the same position and they're all family in a way. So it looks like egalitarianism. And then you have villages which are matriarchal in a way, but this means actually they are egalitarian. So this is mainly in the northeast, and there it's community and everybody's like, say, rather similar in status, but there's no caste. Caste doesn't exist. And then you have villages where the castes live in different parts of the village, and usually the upper caste lives near the water source, the clean water, and the lowest caste, or the Dalits, the outcasts, they live near the dump and where there's no water, and the others live in between. And sometimes this is really extreme. Sometimes the relations are like slavery, or they are slavery. The outcasts also, they are real slaves, and when they misbehave, they get beaten up or they even get killed, and you have this on a daily basis in India, and it's as violent as a favela in Brazil. It's really violent, and it's completely incredible what happens in these places. But it's a huge variation, and these villages were then integrated, historically speaking, and we speak about a long history, 5,000 years at least. These were integrated into larger political structures, and some of these structures were more like republics, and some of these structures were real monarchies, really authoritarian and hierarchical, and everything in between. And these states came and disappeared and got larger and smaller, and some of these states became so large that they covered much of India, but there was never an Indian state before the British came. So parts or large parts of India were covered sometimes, but there was never an Indian state. This is a creation by the British. So, and the British creation comprised what is today India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Burma, and was then British India. But within this British India, you had all this variation, and you had about 600 independent states. This is not really known, but formally 600 of these political unions remained independent under British colonialism, and that's why they retained their social structure to a large degree. And that means the local structures were retained and the state structure was retained. And then came independence, and all of this was integrated into a socialist Indian state. But this means the Indian state integrated those independent, often monarchies or other structures into India. And even today, if you go to certain places, I give you an example, you go to Jodhpur in Rajasthan, you have a Maharaja, so a king, who basically owns everything. And he's the most influential person, and you cannot do anything without him, even though it's a democracy, and it used to be even a socialist democracy. But since this guy owned everything and these people were really rich, they are still rich and influential and so on. So in order to understand what's going on locally and even in the larger region, you have to understand these structures, and they still persist. And since India's not only multicultural but also multilingual, you have different terminologies in different parts of India. And this is the main problem for our interviews. We need people who speak the different languages, but then also can translate for us others to understand. So we have, so far we have interviews in 10 major languages. Yeah. Who also all have their different writing systems and so on. Anyway, to make matters worse, caste comes into play. And caste, as we know it today, is a construction by British colonialism. Very much like race also in a country like Brazil. Caste was constructed by the British. It did exist, but it didn't play so much of a role before British intervention. And what happened? The British conquered India, or what they called India, and then they had this huge variation of structures that I talked about. And they didn't understand how it worked. But they did find that caste existed, and they tried to find out how it works. But then the problem was somebody who was high caste in one area was low caste in another area. Or the caste was, say, on the second rank here, on the third rank there, and so on. And if you move, you had to change your relative position and so on. So the British just determined, okay, we structure the society in these ancient castes, which were documented in the ancient writings of about 800 before Christ. And the Brahmins, the highest caste, they informed the British about the structure because they were the intellectuals, and they wanted to elevate their own status. And they said, this is how our society works. And the British said, oh, it's written, so it's old culture. Oh, it works all over, so we take this. Now we check. You are... Yeah, okay. No, we put you there. You're Vaishya, you're Brahmin, you're Kshatriya. And we fix it like this. And even if you're from the same subcaste, but now from different regions, okay, we put you in this and that category. And they created, of course, instead of order, they created a huge chaos, because each subcaste everywhere wanted to move upwards. So the people told lies, and they tried to change the history of their community and so on. And it was a huge chaos, and this chaos persists up to this day. So castes fight for their classification, and today many castes fight for downgrading. Why? Because then they get reservations and quotas to enter university or government jobs and so on. So every day you turn on the news now, and you'll read something about caste violence and mobilization in India. Just go to any Indian website, you'll see something now. And it's all due to British intervention, because they sort of misinterpret caste, both intentionally and by accident. But it structures Indian society today. It's important for Indian society today. So you have to take this colonial social culture into account as well. And all of these come together and they don't fit neatly, and it's not only that you need an indigenous language and a Western language, you need several languages in order to understand this and to bring this together. So, to conclude, first of all, points of comparison. That's kind of easy now to wind down. Because I already said all of this first, the earlier social structures persist after the capitalist transformation as their own structures, like in Thailand or India, but they also sort of shape the social classes, and they are slowly over time, the longer capitalism lasts, being absorbed by the social classes. And then the class structure itself is very much shaped by the pre-capitalist hierarchies. And the degree of, say, the emergence of classes and the persistence of pre-capitalist hierarchies depends on the particular configuration. So as we've seen in Brazil, the pre-capitalist hierarchies are still important, but they're not clearly active. And this would now be my answer to the question about race. You understand race in Brazil only against the background of colonial and racist structures, but they don't exist as a separate structure anymore. So there's no apartheid, there's no two-sided structure like in Thailand, but there's only one capitalist structure in Brazil, with some aspects being more rooted in the past and some aspects being more rooted in the present, so to speak. In Germany, the past is even less visible than in Brazil because the transformation took place earlier, and as we've seen in India or Thailand, it's very visible or even active, existing. So yes, the final point here is clear about race and hierarchies. We talked about it. And the final point is about global inequality. Both the comparison and the global, structure we have not completed yet. So I hope next year or the year after I can write a book about this, because now we've covered so many countries, and I hope next year we will have completed US and India. China, we already have a good idea. So I think some of the most important and also most different types of societies are covered. But we're not done yet. But it's very evident, and this is probably all self-evident to most of you anyway, the global structure, which by dependency theory or world systems theory has been called center-periphery relations, is very visible in our research. So it's very clear that the lower classes are much larger in the global south and smaller in the north, and the opposite as well. The upper classes are smaller in the south and larger in the north. And this is due to colonial exploitation and the continuations of colonial structures up to this day. It seems, though, that in capitalism, the structure that I showed with regard to Germany is something that evolves, that is the strong correlation between capital, labor, and class, but not exactly as Marx showed us, or the later Marx showed us. So a clear and uniform opposition of capital and labor, but more this distinction of non-labor, labor, and elite labor, plus capital. But still, you could argue from another perspective, this capital-labor opposition is also visible in this. And as I said, the class structure that Marx shows us in the Communist Manifesto is more complex, and it seems to be something that we can even sort of find today as the roots of contemporary German classes. Final point, and this sort of concerns migration, because you asked about this. I did answer, but not fully. The, say, upper classes become more globalized, and we can see it in ourselves. It doesn't really matter if I work in Germany or if I work here. Of course, I would have to learn better Portuguese, but then I would fit in to a large degree, and same would be even true the other way around. When you from the global south come to the north, you would also fit in, more or less. There would be more, say, discrimination in this regard, not so much on the, say, on the basis of race, but on the basis of the colonial structure. You would still be somebody from the global south, so who's not as valuable as somebody from the north. But in principle, not much difference. And we studied this in Germany in much detail before the so-called refugee crisis. And in our data, we didn't see any differences really between migrants and non-migrants. So if you didn't include the category of geographical origin, you were unable to see in the data whether this person was a migrant or a non-migrant. Because also in the lowest class, the same characteristics are there as in the German lowest class, so no self-confidence, no social capital, no cultural, no and symbolic capital, and so on. So it's very similar, but in more detail, the habitus remains more localized in the lowest classes. So if an Indian peasant migrates to Brazil or to Germany, he or she would not be able to integrate. But the characteristic of the lowest class is precisely that it's not integrated, but it's fragmented. And people have few friends and few social activities and so on. But still, these persons would remain more outsiders than the others. And as I just said, in principle, there's a tendency towards the migrants from the south being relegated when they come to the north, and not so much the other way around. That's it. Thank you.